Dry Creek, Arizona Territory, 1881. The desert wind was sharp that night, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and distant rain. Clara Dane stood on her ranch porch, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other, staring into the emptiness of Arizona Territory. The stars hung low and cold over the land, and the only sound was the creak of the windmill out back. She'd been alone since February, when her father had finally lost his fight against pneumonia, and her mother followed him into the ground not 2 weeks later. 23 and already running the ranch by herself, Clara worked sunup to sundown just to keep the place from falling to ruin. She told herself it was strength. In truth, it was stubbornness and fear of what waited if she let go. That's when she heard it. Hoofbeats, not steady. Easy riding. Desperate. A single horse, coming fast down the wash that led straight to her place. Clara's grip tightened on the rifle. Folks didn't ride this late unless they had reason. And in this territory, reasons usually came with trouble. The light from her lantern threw long shadows as she stepped off the porch and into the yard. The rider came out of the dark like a ghost, hunched low in the saddle, a shape barely clinging to life. The horse was lathered in sweat, eyes wild, foam dripping from its mouth. It skidded to a stop in the yard, and before Clara could even call out, the man toppled sideways. "Hey!" She ran forward, heart hammering. "Hold on!" But he was already gone. The knife wound in his ribs was deep, the kind no doctor could fix. He'd bled most of the way here. His eyes opened once, clouded and fevered. His lips moved. For her, not me. Then he died. That's when Clara saw it. A bundle lashed tight against his chest. Her breath caught. She fumbled with the straps, nearly dropping her lantern as the bundle wriggled and wailed. A baby. Tiny, hungry fists pumping weakly at the air. Dark hair matted to its head. A face scrunched tight from crying, but unmistakably alive. Clara stood frozen for a heartbeat, lantern light glinting off the tears suddenly in her eyes. Then instinct took over. She carried the child inside, wrapped her in clean cloth, fed her with warm milk from the stove. The baby latched on and drank greedily, quieting to soft whimpers as the storm of her arrival passed. Clara didn't even realize she'd started rocking until the chair creaked under her. "Easy, little one. You're safe now." But she wasn't sure that was true. The burial Clara buried the rider at dawn behind the windmill. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story. Just carved unknown rider into a wooden cross and said a prayer over the red dirt mound. The baby, she named her Rose because it was the only soft thing she'd seen in months, slept inside the cabin, swaddled near the fire. By mid-morning, Clara knew she should take Rose into town, handy. Her over to Sheriff Hale, and let the law handle things. But every time she pictured leaving the child with strangers, her chest tightened. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was something deeper, something she didn't dare name. She stayed. The rider's comet was 2 nights later when the trouble arrived. Clara had just put Rose down to sleep when 3 horses rode into the yard. They didn't knock. The door flew open, and in stepped Rafe Deacon, a tall man with a scar cutting across his cheek, 2 mean-looking riders behind him. His revolver gleamed in the lantern light. "Evening, miss," Deacon drawled, glancing around. The small cabin, like he owned it. "We're looking for something came through here. A package." Clara's hand slid under the table, fingers brushing the stock of her rifle. "A man came through, yes. But he's dead now." Rafe's grin widened without reaching his eyes. "Not the man, the babe. His gaze flicked toward the cradle by the fire. "That's her, ain't it?" Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. "Leave." "Now that ain't neighborly." He nodded to one of his men. "Take her." The outlaw took a step toward the cradle and froze. Another horse approached, hooves pounding steady, not desperate like the rider who'd come before. A shadow passed the window, then the door swung open again without a knock. The man who stepped in was tall, broad-shouldered, with long black hair bound in a warrior's knot, and a Winchester balanced easy in his hands. His eyes, dark as midnight, swept the room once and landed on Deacon. "Step away," the stranger said, voice low and steady. Deacon sneered. "This ain't your fight, savage." The man didn't move. "The child stays." Deacon drew first. The stranger fired quicker. Gunpowder lit the room like lightning. One of Deacon's men went down hard. The other scrambled for the door as bullets smashed through the cabin walls. Clara grabbed the rifle from under the table and fired, missing, but sending the outlaw tumbling out into the night. When the smoke cleared, Deacon was gone. But not for long. The stranger lowered his rifle. His gaze shifted to Clara, then to the cradle. "My name's Niko Blackstone," he said, voice as steady as his aim. "And that child, she's my blood." Uneasy allies by morning, Clara knew more than she'd ever wanted. Niko Blackstone was half Apache, half Mexican, a man hunted by bounty hunters and outlaws alike. The baby, Rose, was his niece. His sister had been murdered by Deacon's gang for refusing to sell her land near the San Carlos reservation. Before dying, she'd sent Rose with a rider to find Niko. Now Deacon wanted the baby, not for love, but because she was the last legal heir to that land. "You can stay here," Niko said as he saddled his horse. "But they'll come again." "They won't stop." Clara crossed her arms. "So you're just riding off with a baby, bleeding through that bandage like you ain't half dead?" "This is Apache business." "This is human business," she shot back. "You'll need help." Something passed between them then. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Two people carrying too much weight to set it down. Niko nodded once. "Then pack light. We ride at night." The first night ride. The desert was black and endless under a new moon. Clara rode behind Niko, Rose cradled in her arms, the sound of their horses' hooves swallowed by sand. They avoided roads, sticking to washes and dry gullies, keeping low. Every time an owl called or a coyote howled, Clara felt her pulse jump. At dawn they stopped in a rocky canyon, building no fire. Niko cleaned his wound in silence, his hands sure and practiced. Clara watched him, torn between fear and curiosity. "You're not afraid of me," he said suddenly, not looking up. "Should I be?" "Most people are." "I'm more afraid of being alone," she said quietly. He glanced at her then, eyes unreadable. "That makes two of us." The canyon attack by the third night, Deacon had found them. They'd barely made camp when rifle shots cracked across the canyon walls, sparks flying off the rocks. Clara hit the ground, shielding Rose with her own body. Niko moved like lightning, returning fire from behind a boulder. The fight was brutal and close. Clara's hands shook, but she loaded and fired the rifle anyway, the way her father had taught her. One outlaw went down screaming. Another tried to circle behind, only to meet Niko's knife in the dark. Deacon himself stayed back, shouting orders, his voice echoing through the canyon. "This ain't over, Blackstone. You can't run forever!" When the shooting stopped, two men lay dead and the others scattered. Niko's arm was bleeding again. Clara helped him back to the horses, Rose crying so hard it broke her heart. Santa. Fee, Niko said through clenched teeth. Judge Hurst will hear the claim. We end this there. That's a week's ride, Clara said. Then we ride at night, Niko repeated. The desert at night was colder than Clara had ever imagined. The wind came down from the hills, sharp as broken glass, rattling the mesquite and sage. Clara pulled her coat tighter around Rose, holding the baby close to her chest to block the chill, while Niko Blackstone led the way through an arroyo barely wide enough for their horses. They hadn't spoken much since the canyon fight. Niko's arm was bound tight with Clara's last strip of clean cloth, but the bleeding had slowed. He moved like a man who'd been hurt before. No complaints, no wasted words, just a steady push forward. Clara hated the silence almost as much as the dark. It left her alone with thoughts she didn't want, about the stranger buried behind her ranch, about Rafe Deacon's eyes when he'd seen Rose, and about the man riding ahead of her now. Who was Niko Blackstone, really? Apache warrior? Outlaw? Something in between? And why did she trust him already, when every instinct said not to trust anyone out here? First campfire. They stopped just before dawn in a dry wash choked with boulders. Niko built no fire, but Clara convinced him Rose needed warmth. He gave her one silent look, a reminder that fire meant smoke, and smoke meant Deacon's scouts. Then nodded once, and struck a spark. The fire burned low, barely more than embers. Clara fed Rose from a bottle and rocked her gently, while Niko cleaned his rifle and checked his knife edge with movements almost ritualistic. You fight like you were born to it, Clara said finally, voice low. Niko didn't look up. My father taught me. He fought for both sides, the Union and the Apache, and belonged to neither. That sounds lonely. It is. He glanced at her then. Your hands didn't shake when you fired. They did after, Clara admitted. Pa taught me too. He said a rifle's only as good as the heart behind it. Niko's eyes lingered on her, unreadable. Your father was right. They sat in silence for a while. The baby fussed, then dozed off. Niko stared into the embers as if seeing something far away. Why are you doing this? He asked suddenly. Clara blinked. What do you mean? You could have stayed at your ranch. Deacon would have come, taken the child and been gone. Clara bristled. You think I'd hand over a baby to men like that? I think most people would. Something in his tone softened, though, almost like respect. Clara didn't answer. She just pulled her coat tighter and fed another stick to the fire. The ride to Silver Butte. The next 3 days were a blur of dust, wind, and sleepless nights. They avoided the main trail, cutting through dry gulches and rocky ridges, keeping low where the ground broke into shadows. Twice they saw riders on the horizon, Deacon's men scouting ahead, but Niko's keen eyes spotted them early, and they hid until the danger passed. On the 4th night they reached Silver Butte, a ghost town left to rot after the mines. Dried up. Empty shacks leaned at odd angles, doors creaking in the wind. Niko led them to an old mercantile with a roof still mostly intact. Inside, the air smelled of rust and old wood. Clara spread her blanket on the floor, cradling Rose to sleep while Niko kept watch at the door. He'd hardly slept since they left her ranch. You ever stop moving? Clara asked, voice half teasing, half worried. Stopping gets you killed, Niko said flatly. Then, after a pause, but I'll sleep when you do. She looked at him in the dim lantern light, seeing the lines of weariness around his eyes. We're not enemies, Niko. You don't have to stand guard on me. Habit, he muttered. Keeps me breathing. The ambush at Silver Butte. The attack came just before dawn. A sharp whistle split the silence, followed by gunfire shattering the mercantile windows. Clara grabbed Rose and hit the floor as bullets tore through the walls. Niko rolled to cover, returning fire with deadly precision. "Out the back!" he barked. Clara ran, heart hammering, clutching the baby so tight she feared she'd crush her. A shadow loomed at the doorway, one of Deacon's men, and Clara swung her rifle butt hard into his jaw, dropping him cold. They made it to the alley as Niko gunned down another outlaw. Deacon himself was there, scar gleaming in the pale light. He fired once, the bullet tearing through Niko's coat, then cursed as his gun jammed. "Ride!" Niko shouted. He shoved Clara onto her horse and leapt onto his own, blood dripping from his sleeve. Bullets kicked up dust as they galloped out of town, Deacon yelling after them, "You can't run forever, Blackstone. That land's mine, and so's the brat," the old prospector. They didn't stop until dusk, when both horses were lathered and exhausted. They found shelter in a rocky canyon, and that's where they met Glenn Cutter, an old prospector with a long beard and eyes sharp as nails. He stepped out of his shack holding a shotgun but lowered it when he saw the baby. "Well, I'll be," Glenn said, squinting at Niko. "Blackstone blood, sure as sunrise. Your pa saved my hide in the war." He looked at Clara, then at the baby. "And you're running from Rafe Deacon, I'd wager. Man's a snake." Glenn gave them water, jerky, and a place to rest. He warned them that Deacon had put a price on their heads, so high bounty hunters were already on the trail. "He's not just after land," Glenn said. "There's silver in those hills. Whoever holds that claim holds a fortune." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "So Rose is worth killing for." "More'n gold," Glenn said grimly. "Trust earned in blood." That night, Niko woke Clara with a hand over her mouth. His eyes were hard, alert. "Riders," he whispered. 5 men came creeping into the canyon, rifles ready. Glenn Cutter slipped out the back of his shack with a shotgun, while Niko and Clara took cover behind the rocks. The fight was brutal, close quarters, no room for error. Clara shot one man square in the chest. Niko dropped 2 more before a bullet grazed his temple. Glenn blasted another so hard he flew off his feet. The last man fled into the night, but not before shouting, "Deacon's riding with 10 more. You're dead by sunrise." When the smoke cleared, Niko was bleeding again, this time worse. Clara tore her shawl into strips and bound his wound, her hands steady even though her heart pounded like thunder. "You're gonna get yourself killed fighting for me," Niko muttered, voice weak. "I'm fighting for Rose," Clara said. "And you." Something shifted between them then. Not love, not yet, but something dangerous and undeniable, trust born in blood and fire. Santa Fe or die by, dawn they were riding again, leaving Glenn's shack behind. The old prospector promised to mislead Deacon if he came sniffing around. Clara thanked him with tears in her eyes, but Glenn just waved them off. "Don't die out there," he said. "This territory needs more folks. Like you." As the sun rose, Clara felt the weight of everything pressing down. Deacon's pursuit, the danger to Rose, and the strange pull she felt toward the man riding ahead of her. Niko Blackstone was more than just a warrior. He was a wall between her and the darkness chasing them. But walls could fall, and Deacon was closing in. The mountains gave way to open land, and the open land gave way to roads leading straight to Santa Fe. By now, every rider in the territory had heard Deacon's offer. $1,000 for the baby and twice that for Niko Blackstone. Dead or alive. The air itself seemed to hum with danger as they rode, Clara clutching Rose close, while Niko scouted every ridge and shadow. The silent road for 2 days they rode without seeing another soul. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At night, Clara and Niko camped without fire, taking turns keeping watch. When Rose cried, Clara hushed her quickly, praying no one heard. Niko barely slept, his eyes sharp even in the dark. On the morning of the 3rd day they passed a weather-beaten sign. Santa Fe, 20 miles. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "We're almost there," she whispered to Rose, though her voice trembled. She looked at Niko. "Do you think Deacon's already in town?" Niko's jaw tightened. "He's already there, waiting." The town of Law and Shadow Santa Fe was bustling when they arrived, wagons rolling in, traders shouting prices, soldiers marching past on patrol. To anyone else, it looked like peace and prosperity. To Clara, it looked like a trap. Niko guided her through back streets until they reached a small adobe house near the edge of town. Waiting inside was Judge Hurst, a grizzled man with a white beard and eyes like flint. "Blackstone," the judge said. "Haven't seen you since your father stood trial for land disputes. What brings you here?" Niko set Rose on the table gently. "This child's parents were murdered by Rafe Deacon. She's the rightful heir to land Deacon's trying to steal." Judge Hurst leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Niko's eyes met Clara's. She nodded and handed over the papers the dying rider had carried. Land deeds, signed and sealed. The judge scanned them, frowning. "These are genuine. If we file these, the girl inherits. And Deacon loses." "Everything," Clara said. Hurst sighed. "He won't take that kindly. You'll need to stand before the court in the morning. I'll hear your case, but be ready for trouble." The gathering storm, they spent the night barricaded inside the judge's adobe. Niko checked his rifle over and over, then cleaned his knife in silence. Clara tried to rest, but every creak of a toe, the floor made her jump. At one point, Rose whimpered, and Niko, surprisingly gentle, rocked her back to sleep. "You're good with her," Clara whispered. Niko shook his head. "Children deserve better than men like me." Clara almost argued, but his expression stopped her. For a moment she saw past the hard warrior exterior to something else. Someone scarred by loss, someone who'd been carrying too much alone for too long. Before dawn, a gunshot shattered the stillness. Then another. Niko threw open the door to see a rider galloping past. A warning. Deacon was here. The courtroom trap. The courtroom was small, crowded, and tense. Clara sat at the front, Rose in her arms, Niko beside her like a coiled spring. Judge Hurst called the hearing to order, but the sound barely cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Deacon stood near the back, smiling coldly, his hand resting on his gun. The judge questioned Clara about the rider who had delivered Rose, the land papers, and Deacon's threats. Her voice stayed steady, though her palms were slick with sweat. Niko spoke next, explaining how they'd been attacked on the trail. When Hurst finally turned to Deacon, the outlaw's smile never wavered. "I just want what's mine, Judge. That land's worthless anyway. Why would I bother with some child?" But the papers didn't lie. The judge slammed his gavel. "This court recognizes Rose Callahan as rightful heir to the Callahan claim. Any interference will be prosecuted as theft under territorial law." Deacon's face hardened. His hand twitched near his revolver, and that's when all hell broke loose. The street fighter shot rang out, not from Deacon, but from one of his men in the crowd. Chaos erupted. Clara ducked, shielding Rose as people screamed and scattered. Niko shoved her behind the judge's bench and drew his rifle in one fluid motion. The fight spilled into the dusty main street of Santa Fe. Bullets flew, glass shattered, and horses reared in panic. Niko moved like lightning, dropping 2 gunmen before they even knew where he was. Clara stayed low, clutching Rose and crawling toward cover. Deacon tried to flank them, but Judge Hurst, surprisingly quick for his age, grabbed a shotgun from behind his desk. "Not today, Deacon," he bellowed, firing a blast that scattered Deacon's men. The outlaw leader turned to run, but Niko was faster. The 2 men collided in the street, fists flying, guns knocked away. Deacon fought dirty, swinging a knife, but Niko twisted his arm and drove him into the dust. "You should have left the child alone," Niko growled. Deacon sneered. "She ain't worth dying for." Niko's punch silenced him for good. When it was over, Deacon lay in the dust, groaning, as soldiers dragged him off in irons, a choice beyond the law. The judge thanked them both and offered protection, even a reward. But Niko shook his head. "The girl's safe now, that's all. That matters." Clara looked at him surprised. "You're just leaving?" "I don't belong in towns," he said simply. "Men like Deacon aren't the only ones who want me dead." Clara hesitated. Then, before he could mount his horse, she stepped closer. "What if we don't stay either?" Niko's brow furrowed. "Clara, you have a home." "Had," she said softly. "Deacon's men burned it. And Rose needs more than a roof. She needs someone who'll fight for her. Someone like you." For the first time, Niko didn't have an answer. His eyes softened, and then he gave a small nod. "All right. But it won't be easy," Clara smiled faintly. "Nothing worth doing ever is." A new beginning. Weeks later, far from Santa Fe, they found a hidden valley between 2 ridges. Green grass, fresh water, and no one for miles. Clara planted a small garden while Niko built a cabin with his own hands. Rose learned to crawl on the cabin floor while the wind sang through the pines. At night, Clara sat by the fire, Rose asleep in her arms, watching Niko sharpen his knife or carve wood into small toys for the baby. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. They were no longer just fugitives. They were a family. And though the world beyond the valley would always be dangerous, Clara knew they'd face it together. The end. But the beginning of many more tales in Ironwood.